Hello and welcome back to my Dandelion Diaries. Today we are continuing on with the fountain pen beginners series that I started. So if you missed episode 1, it was all about fountain pens themselves. I'll have that in the description as a link, and then I'll also try to put it up in the cards. But today's episode is all going to be about ink, which I feel like is something I'm pretty well suited in my wheelhouse, considering I primarily do ink swatching videos on this channel. We're going to be talking about a few different things about ink today, trying to keep it as beginner friendly as possible. Honestly, fountain pen ink is an entire rabbit hole that you can spend years in because of how much stuff that goes on with ink. But I'm going to be talking about ink properties and characteristics today. Basically like the different things you could see in an ink, kind of like the waterproof versus dye inks as well. Some ink additives, ink mixing, and then I'm also going to be talking about like bottles versus samples, and then some various tools that I personally think would be a great start to any beginner who's just getting started with ink. Like even if you don't want a pen, you just want to start with ink, I'm going to be talking about some tools for that. But let's go ahead and get started with ink properties. So I have two binders here. These are my 𝗂𝗵𝘃𝗃𝗃 26 ring binders, and I keep this as like my ink archive of literally all the different inks I ever swatch, and they're in color category. So I'm going to be using this as the example of showcasing the different ink properties I want to talk about, and I'm going to do my best to kind of give really firm examples, nothing that's going to be super wishy-washy. So the first property I want to talk about is ink shading. So whenever you buy a fountain pen ink, there will be a property to it most likely, and shading is probably the most common. So I'm going to try to find a really good shader. Okay, so Citrus Black here is probably one of my favorite shading inks ever. It is by Platinum, and it's because it starts off as a bright yellow color, and as it dries on the page, it shades or turns a different color, and it turns into this black shade here. So it goes from like a vibrant yellow, almost like this yellow, if not a little bit brighter, and shades all the way to this dark, almost black yellow color. Another good example is this 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏 Opera Rose here, how it has a lighter color that shades darker. That's pretty much all that shading is it's going from one color to either a darker version of that color or an entirely different color altogether, which we could talk about chroma shading in this category as well. So let me go to my blues. So Sailor inks are a really great example of chroma shading. And chroma shading, like regular shading, is essentially a change in color in the same ink. A lot of times the shading properties are only visible in like larger swatches like this, or in really juicy writing pens, or broader nibbed pens like a medium to a broad nibbed pen, even a stub nib pen, which would probably showcase everything for you in general. However, with shading, I think these inks do really well with painting. So if you don't like using pens, but you like to paint and you want to use fountain pen ink kind of like watercoloring, having a chroma shade like this looks really dynamic in whatever painting style you like to do. I particularly like to do florals, and I really like how they look with the different florals kind of shifting in the petally colors. Okay, I think that's a pretty basic overview of shading. Now let's talk about the ink characteristic or ink property of shimmer, which I feel like is pretty well loved in the fountain pen community. If you like shimmer inks, you do. If you don't like shimmer inks, you don't. So here is, I think I have a whole page of shimmers. Yeah. So here is an entire page of shimmery purple inks. So all that shimmer inks mean is that it has shimmer particles, or glitter, if you will, mixed into the ink. When you buy an ink that has shimmer, you have to shake the bottle, which I'll show an example of in a little bit. You have to shake it up so the shimmer, emulsifies into the liquid or the ink, so you get an even amount of shimmer per ink. If you are not shaking properly, if you don't mix the shimmer in well enough, it can cause issues in writing in pens. And there are certain pens that behave better with shimmer inks than others, which I think I talked about in my first video, but I can probably touch on that again in this one. So shimmer inks essentially just mean it's got glitter in it. It's going to be shiny, it's going to be shimmery, it's going to have a lot of fun things going on with it. Okay, so before I move on to the next spot, let's go ahead and talk about how to mix a bottle of shimmered ink. So as you can see in this bottle of Ferris Press, there is a big patch of shimmer right here. So whenever you're like wanting to immerse the shimmer into the rest of the ink, you don't want to aggressively shake it because it's going to cause air bubbles to form in the neck of the bottle where you would be filling the pen from. So whenever you get a shimmer ink, you want to roll it. I think these ones are the easiest ones to showcase this with, but you want to roll it in your hands to kind of mix the shimmer. You can roll it upside down if you want. You just want it to be really gently mixed so you're not creating a bunch of bubbles. As you can see, there's no kind of like shimmery particles stuck to the walls anywhere. And I think that rolling it simply like this in your hands is the easiest way to get the shimmer particles to move around versus aggressively shaking it like this. So if you were to aggressively shake it again, you're going to get those air bubbles in the neck of the bottle. And when you put your fountain pen in there, it's going to cause a lot of air to be uptook into like the cartridge or the piston or whatever you're filling your pen with. So just be mindful when you have a shimmer ink, roll or gently back and forth, but this takes forever. That's why I like to roll. So that way you're not getting any air bubbles in the neck of the bottle. Next property is all about sheen, and sheening inks are kind of like shimmery inks, but they don't have the glitter particles. They're just shiny. I think my boys are in this up. And essentially, oh, here's a good one. The sheen is just a very shiny pooling of ink. It's like the ink is so saturated that it creates the sheen on the page. I don't know the exact chemistry or like basis of how the sheen appears. I could probably look that up, but I as this is pretty beginner, I'm just gonna say sheen is the shiny ink. Okay, like it's just gonna be ink that's really shiny. In big swatches like this, it's super shiny on the top, and then in writing, a lot of times you'll just get the shiny on the edges of the letters. Some inks are much more sheen heavy than others, and sometimes depending on the ink company, they will literally describe it as a sheening ink. Other times you just kind of figure it out once you get the ink and you swatch it. Okay, now let's talk about dry versus wet. So if you've watched any of my videos, I typically talk about this ink's really wet, it's got a good flow, or this ink's really dry, it's not super flowy, so you might want to put it in a wet flowing pen. All that means is that when you initially use the ink in a pen, and this is very specific to individual pens and individual inks, is that when you initially write with it, it's not going to feel like the ink is just gushing out of the pen. It's not going to feel as flowing. Like the flowing is the best word I can come up with for this. So if you have a really wet ink, for example, like this Birmingham Pen Company Interstellar Bronze, the sheening one I just did, is pretty wet and it causes a really good flow with the pen. So you get an even amount of ink every time you write. If you get an overly wet ink, like this document, Urban Sienna is a very, very wet ink. So if you get an overly wet ink, what can happen is it causes the nib line of your pen to be much broader than you were probably expecting. But it also can cause issues with bleed through, feathering, and even like just, I don't know, misbehaving on the page. And there's a lot of inks that do that, and there's a lot of inks that don't. It's very specific to individual inks. And again, since this is more of like just for beginners, I would focus mainly on finding the color that you are looking for and then worrying about dry versus wet later after you get comfortable with having an ink and a pen together. It's really more of a preference once you get to that point, but I just want to explain briefly, you know, dry versus wet. So drier inks just have a little less flow to them and wetter inks have a bit more of a flow to them. And it is very specific on each ink and each brand as well. Okay, now that's a good segue to work into the pigment versus dye ink, since I already showed this document ink here. So there are inks out there that are going to be waterproof and or water resistant, and then there's going to be inks that are not. So typically those are the two inks that you'll find are dye-based inks, which are going to be your classic everyday inks. No pigment is used. They're water, like washable in a way. Like if I were to spill water on this page, which I would totally cry, the inks would just, you know, disappear, most likely. If I were to spill water on the document ink that I just showed, it would not disappear because it's made with pigment. So the pigment particles are immersed in the solution of the ink and they dry down in a permanent fashion onto the paper, versus the dye particles dye into the paper. And think of it like a tie-dye shirt. If you wash it over and over again, sometimes ink stays, sometimes it doesn't. So the dye will wash out, pigment will not. All that being said, pigment inks are a bit more high maintenance when it comes to fountain pen cleaning, but they do work in most fountain pens. Definitely, like as a beginner, like if you're really interested in an expensive pen, look and see, like do your research and see if putting a pigment ink in it would be worth it. Some of the pens that are harder to clean, like more vintage pens or like vacuum fillers and stuff like that, they may not be best to put pigment inks in because they are harder to clean. The downside of pigment inks is they can clog over time because the pigment will settle in the feed of the pen. Here, I have a Benu here. So like the pigment will settle in this part. Focus. The pigment will settle into this part of the pen and then it becomes hard to write with. So with pigment inks, you just have to do a bit more pen maintenance, but they're still really great, especially because they are waterproof. So if you are out and about journaling outside, or if you maybe have a lot of flood risks in your area, having pigment inks for your journals that you plan to keep for a long time might be better suited to you than dye inks. But I will also say pigment inks are a lot more restricted in color. So dye-based inks are more popular, more available. Pigment inks are less available. Like there's less variety when it comes to those colors. I would say the brand that has the most pigment ink colors is going to be the 𝗬𝗏𝗏 document line. And a lot of their inks you can actually mix together to create new colors as well. Okay, I think that's all I want to talk about for pigment versus dye inks for beginners. Any of these topics we can go down a 30-minute video with because of just how extensive inks can be. But now I want to talk about ink additives. So I have two additives here. I have a shimmer additive and a dilution solution additive. I don't know what happened to my other bottle of white lightning, but I'm going to talk about it and just pretend that it's here. I'll try to insert a picture of what white lightning looks like. I get mine from Vanessa. So let's talk about the shimmer additive first. So 𝗦𝘃𝗃 offers these really cool little bottles of shimmer particles. So if you like shimmer inks and you want to add shimmer to an ink that doesn't have it already, you can get one of these, which is basically a bottle of shimmer. So if I were to shake it up, it's really shimmery. This is 𝗦𝘃𝗃𝗏, by the way. And this would add kind of like a green iridescent shimmer to whatever ink that I mixed this with. A lot of times these types of things have instructions on how much to add to an ink, and this isn't necessarily super beginner friendly, but it is additive, and I do want to talk about it because it's something you could be aware of if you're wanting to just play with more inks. So shimmer particles are available in additives like this by 𝗦𝘃𝗃. I've also seen them by Pannonia. I haven't really seen too many other brands come out with just shimmer additives, but these are really nice if you like shimmery inks, or if you have like an ink that doesn't have shimmer, like a Pilot Shizuku ink, and you want to add shimmer to it, then you have this option. The other additive that I just showed was the dilution solution by Birmingham Pen Company. So this is really great if you wanted to kind of thin out an ink for making it a little bit lighter, maybe even flow a little bit better. I primarily use this when I'm mixing inks from Birmingham Pen Company in general, but you could easily add this to a sheening ink if you're having issues with the sheen being a little too much, and it might help dilute the sheen just a little bit. I do think this is only available in the US. Now let's talk about white lightning. So insert photo here of the white lightning. White lightning is essentially a dilution solution in a way that it helps with the flow of an ink. So if I were to have a very dry ink like this 𝗦𝘃𝗏𝗏, this is a very dry ink. I have a lot of trouble with this flowing in pens. I also have a lot of trouble flowing with dip pens even. So if I were to add a couple of drops of that white lightning solution to this, it would thin it enough or add enough of a wetness to it that it would flow a little bit better in pens. White lightning is completely safe as far as I know for any pen out there. So just keep that in mind if you wanted to use something like an additive to help an ink that you may already have perform a little bit better or give a different characteristic for what you're looking for. Okay, next I want to talk about ink mixes. So I'll use, what colors do I want to use? I'll use green. Green's a good one. So there's also mixing inks. So if you wanted to mix inks together, you would have to have something to mix them in, like a sample vial holder or a jar or whatever. And the danger is if you mix inks across certain brands, you can cause issues with the chemistry of those inks. So my biggest suggestion for a beginner, if you wanted to delve into ink mixing, again, for a beginner, if you wanted to delve into ink mixing, definitely stick to within brands. So I like to mix Pilot Hiroshizuku inks together, so I could mix this 𝗬𝗏𝘁 with another blue to make it a more blue versus like more of a blurple. I could mix this with a pink to make it more purpley. I could mix it with a green to make kind of like a teal blurple. I don't know. I've never mixed it with green, but I would only mix within the same brand family. So Pilot Hiroshizuku inks mixing another Pilot Hiroshizuku ink together would be okay. Ferris wheel press, I would say the same thing. Mixing a Ferris wheel press ink with a Ferris wheel press ink, I think you'd still be okay. Same with even diamine, you know, mixing a diamine ink with another diamine ink, I think you'd be okay. I would not do something like mix Ferris wheel press and diamine together, just because the risk of the chemistries of the different inks not mixing correctly, it can cause issues. I mean, I'm not a chemist, so I can't really speak to like corrosion or caustic or anything like that, but it may cause breakdown of pen parts. It could cause breakdown of vials. I mean, you don't know what type of chemicals or chemistry they use to make the inks, so I only like to mix within the same brand. That's just me. If anybody else wants to, you know, add in on that, if you mix your own inks, if you mix across brands and have success, I think that's fantastic. I just think for a beginner starting out, just mixing within the same brand of inks is probably going to be your best bet. And then as you get more comfortable, you can branch into the other worlds. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about samples versus bottles. So I have a sample rack here with several samples on it. If you are a beginner, which is what this video is all about, buy samples. If you can get a sample of the ink that you are looking at, get a sample first. Highly, 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 highly recommend getting a sample first. So a lot of brands are available on Goulet pens. They have Sailor, Diamine, Noodlers, Rohr & Klingner, a bunch of those. Another company I absolutely love to buy from is Vaness. I think Vaness has the biggest sample selection that I've seen, at least here in the States. They have, I think, over 2,000 different inks to choose from or something like that. They have a banner on their website about it. You can also swap inks with friends. I mean, if you have a pen friend and they have an ink collection that they're willing to share from, you can order sample vials like this off of Amazon, or I think you can probably get them at Walmart even, and send ink to your friends this way. And that way you have a sample of it before you delve into the bottle. And the reason why I highly suggest samples for beginners is because you don't know like, and until you know, you don't know. And this is even me coming in, years down the line with inks. Like, I primarily buy samples because if I try an ink and I hate it and I don't want to have, then I don't want to have 50 milliliters of it to do nothing with. Like, if I were to get Colorverse Matter in a 50 ml bottle and find out, wow, this is a really light ink, I can't even read this, and I have 50 mils of it, what am I going to do with it now? I mean, the options are endless when it comes to using fountain pen inks, but it's like, buy the sample first, find out if you even like the color or like the way the ink behaves before you purchase a bigger bottle of it. I do think this is, not necessarily the best for the earth in terms of, you have barely any ink and it's in a little plastic tube that you're probably going to throw away or recycle if you're great. But yeah, this is probably not the best in terms of, sustainability, but it's cheaper and you get to try more colors and you get to find out more of what you like. If you don't really switch your colors that often, I think you could try a sample of it, like it, get a bottle, and move on with your life. Okay, that's enough about samples. Bottles, there is so many different kinds of bottles out there. I mean, we could be here for an hour and a half at least talking about different bottles of ink. There's glass bottles, there's plastic bottles, there's bottles that are shaped really funny, or like perfume bottles. Like the options for bottled ink are, again, endless. And every brand, every company has a different style when it comes to the ink bottles they like to use. Probably one of the most well-known is the 𝗬𝘗𝘁𝗵𝗁 bottles, which I'll just open this up because of their classic shape, and they have a really thick glass bottom which helps weigh it down so it doesn't tip over. So that's another thing if you think about buying a fountain pen ink bottle. Maybe look at the bottle itself. If you have the ability to go to like a store and see what it looks like, hold it in your hands, maybe try to knock it over if you're prone to knocking things over. Some bottles are much better than others about stability. I personally love the 𝗬𝘗𝘁𝗵𝗁 bottles. I love the Birmingham Pen Company ink bottles. I do not love the plastic 30 ml diamine ink bottles because these are so easy to just tump over. Like, it's, yes. And they're not my favorite, but I don't use enough ink to buy the giant 80 ml bottles of these. Anyways, there's lots of different ink bottles out there and each one is slightly different. Some have glass, some have plastic. It's just dependent on brand. I did want to show the Ackerman bottle, the Dutch Masters bottle, just because this is a really unique bottle. And I don't know too many brands, if any, that have this kind of design. So it's like this, and in the top here, there's a little glass marble. So when you fill the pen, you have to tip this to put ink in the top part, unscrew it, and then fill from the top reservoir. And then you can put the ink back down by slowly tilting it back down, and then you let the ink back down here. You will always have ink up at the top until you absolutely run out. I just think the bottle design is really nifty and really cool. And if you wanted to get an Ackerman ink, this is usually what their bottles come in. Okay, I think that's enough for ink bottles versus samples. But ink also comes in cartridges, which I talked a little bit about these on my fountain pen video. That cartridges are usually specific to certain companies. I believe Pilot and Sailor have specific cartridges for their pens, but there are also international cartridges which will fit most of the other pens out there. Let's see if I can get a cartridge out. So with these, it is a tiny tube of ink that is plastic, and you essentially just insert this into the pen. This is not really great if you don't use the type of pen that takes a cartridge. These, however, are fantastic if you need to have an easy way to use ink and you like the colors that are offered in a cartridge form. Cartridges are pretty limited in colors and you can't really mix them, so you're going to get what you're going to get with these, but they are really great and very easy to use if you are a beginner. Again, I talked about this in my pen video. I highly recommend starting out with like a Pilot Kakuno. You get a black cartridge like this and you're good to go right off the bat, and it's easy. So beginner wise, inks, I think these are the easiest to use. But I think if you're wanting to like delve into the world of bottled inks, definitely start with samples first. Okay, I think I'm ready to talk about tools. There's a lot of different things that you can use when it comes to fountain pen ink in terms of tools, which I think I'm missing one. Hold on. And I'm primarily going to talk about things to use with actual ink for pens. I'm not really going to talk about swatching today because swatching is a whole different ballgame when it comes to using inks. And I think I've talked about that a lot in all of the swatching videos that I've done. So let's just talk about tools for pens. So whenever you're filling a pen and you don't have a way to fill the pen without, or let's say you're struggling to fill the pen, you can use a dropper. You can use a syringe. This is a flat nose syringe. You can get these in multi-packs on Amazon. You can get them from Jet Pens, and most pen retailers will sell these as well. It is just a flat syringe. It's not going to poke you. It's very thick in terms of the needle, and it has 3 ml capacity. This one does at least. So it says single use. I reuse these all the time. I just wash them out with water, considering I mainly put ink in them and not any kind of medicine or anything like that. But the tip unscrews, and I like to store mine this way so it dries out the whole time and I don't get anything stuck anywhere. Anyways, you can use these to fill an eyedropper pen. You can use these to fill a piston filler. You can even use these to refill cartridges, which some of, like the Pilot cartridges, I like to refill those versus using a cartridge converter for the Pilot pens because the cartridges hold more ink. So these 2 tools are fantastic, and highly recommend having these 2 tools as a beginner because they are excellent when it comes to filling pens, especially from very small bottles like the sample vials if you need to fill a pen that way. Also, you may want to get an ink miser. So this is a little like funnel shaped plastic thing. I'm losing words right now. And you would essentially fill ink here, and you would dip your pen in like this to fill it up. I will say this is only necessary if you are at the very bottom depths of an ink vial, ink sample vial, or you're having trouble filling a pen through the nib and feed. But essentially you would dip this into the ink, twist up the cartridge, and then the pen would fill with ink. Next, this is kind of about more of samples. If you are going to be investing or purchasing the samples like this, I highly recommend getting a sample vial holder. I actually did not have one of these for like the first few years of my fountain pen journey. This was a gift by my friend Priscilla, but these are super handy because they hold the fountain pen vial of ink, and they're very sturdy. Like they won't, you can't spill this over when it's in something like this. There are lots of companies that sell these. This one is specifically by Olive Frogs Designs. There's also a Fountain Pendulum who makes wooden ones, which I think are beautiful. There's lots of endless opportunities for the, little sample vial holder contraptions. If you don't want to spend money on this, I bet you have a tape dispenser like this in your house. You can also put a sample vial holder in this. That'll work just fine for your needs. I mean, this is what I used, so it worked great in terms of holding the sample vial holders, and that it didn't have any kind of spillage. I can't knock it over. It's just fine in there. You can also use a tape, like this is different, but you can use like a washi tape holder. It's not going to be as sturdy as something like the actual vial holder itself, but it will keep it upright and prevent it from spilling all over your desk or your table or whatever you're using. I also want to talk about this actually being little dot stickers. So these are the little dot stickers that I use for my sample vial holders. I get these off of Amazon in like a $200 sticker roll. I find this to be very helpful when it comes to storing samples, which I have several of. So if I can look at the top circle and see what color it is, it helps me easily pick out a color that I want to use for the month, for the day, whatever. So highly recommend having little dot stickers. You can use the Avery ones. You can even make them yourself using sticker paper at home. Last tool that I want to talk about, samples at least, is these. This is a sample vial tray. It holds 50 samples. I get these off of Amazon. They're like $5. I think you can also get them on Pen Chalet, I want to say. But I'll try to, I think I have all of this linked in my storefront on Amazon because I use these so much. I have, I think, over a dozen of these trays now. But yeah, so I highly recommend these. They do disassemble, so they will lay flat if they're not in use, so they don't just take up space. Other brands like Goulet Pens sells them as well, but theirs is branded. Oh, wrong side. Theirs is branded and theirs hold 40 samples and they do not collapse. So I personally like these ones just because they disassemble, and if I don't need them, I can store them in a flat box and they don't take as much space and they hold a bit more samples. Other things that you may want to use as tools for fountain pen inks are dip pens and brushes. So if you're not going to be using a fountain pen per se, but you want to play with fountain pen ink, you can play with dip pens, brushes, really any medium you like to use. You can even use your hands. You're just going to get really messy. But let's talk about dip pens for a second. So I only have one brush. Okay. So these are probably the 4 dip pens that I use the most. I have a Speedball C1 nib here, a Speedball B1 nib here, the 𝗦𝘂𝗃𝗃𝗃 dip pen, and then the Pilot 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 brass dip pen here. So all 4 of these are really great options if you wanted to use fountain pen inks without using a fountain pen. I think that the Speedball ones are really great for calligraphy practice or monoline or any kind of really broad line writing that you want to do. The 𝗦𝘂𝗃𝗃𝗃 dip pen is excellent if you want to write longer periods of time. It has a feed like a normal fountain pen, and it has different nibs that you can change out if you wanted to change your line width. This one has a fude nib specifically, so it's got different line widths within the nib, essentially, depending on how you hold it. But these also are great for storage because you can flip the nib upside down and protect the nib. I really like these. I think they're a little cheaply made. I haven't had any issues with cracking on mine, but I've seen others that have cracking on theirs. So just keep that in mind. It is a plastic dip pen and it is on the more affordable side, but I think they're really great for the different nib options you have, and that it has a feed so you can write a little bit longer with it than, say, a normal dip pen with just the nib itself. Then we have the 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 brass dip nib with the 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 aluminum handle here. This is probably the highest end dip pen that I have, and I adore it. I think it works great. I love the different line widths that I can get from one nib. It holds a lot of ink, and with the aluminum handle, which is definitely a bit pricier than the standard wood handles that come with it, it adds a really nice weight in my hand, and I don't have to worry about the wood warping or getting stained or discolored with the ink washing and everything like that. So those are probably the main dip pens that I would recommend. For a beginner though, oh my gosh. For a beginner though, I would definitely say go with the 𝗦𝘂𝗃𝗃𝗃 dip pen the most. If you can get the fude nib, I think that would be your best option if you only wanted to get one nib. Otherwise, I'd probably get a medium nib and then a broad or even the stub nib they offer, so you can try out different line widths with a dip pen versus buying, you know, a bunch of different fountain pens with a bunch of different nib sizes. The other option for fountain pen ink that I use the most is brushes. This is just a number 4 watercolor brush. Yeah, it's easy to paint with these, and you can draw any kind of thing you want with a brush. I mean, if you like to paint, I think brushes are a really good option. Okay, I think that's all I want to talk about today in terms of ink. I hope I covered enough for a beginner if you wanted to get started with fountain pen ink. There's seriously, I'm not kidding, like the options are seriously so endless when it comes to fountain pen ink. There are thousands and thousands of different colors out there, hundreds of different brands, and they're all slightly different. So it just comes down to trying it out and seeing how you feel when it comes to being a beginner. And I definitely recommend starting with samples before you get bottles, because the samples you're not going to go through as much ink as you think you are. Anyways, I'm going to leave the video off here. If you have any questions about anything I talked about today, please let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to chat. I'm hoping there will be other fountain pen enthusiasts that watch this video that would also love to contribute to maybe fountain pen beginners and what they can do with their inks. And they can drop those down in the comments too. I think it's a really great way to just kind of add to the community and get other perspectives besides my own. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.